we have our special guest today from Sociology Department, Professor Jessica Vasquez-Tokos. Professor Vasquez-Tokos received her bachelor's degree in English from Princeton University and her PhD in sociology from UC Berkeley. And she was a faculty member at the University of Kansas beginning in 2007 until joining the University of Oregon faculty in 2012. So research and teaching areas include race, ethnicity in general, Mexican Americans, Latinos in particular, gender, family, and intermarriage, and also research methodology. So she has published a number of books and public journal articles which focus on her research areas. So please join me in welcoming Professor Vasquez-Tokos.
Thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here. I've never been in the journalism school, but it seems like a neat place with cool people and lots of fun education happening. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of my second book, which is called Marriage Vows and Racial Choices, that concerns Latino family formation. So in the research, I interrogate both in marriage, so Latino-Latino pairings, as well as out marriage. So Latino and white pairings tend to be studied most often. So what gets missed are Latino and non-Latino minority pairings, so Asians, Natives, and Blacks. So I study all of those. And I study, and I'll show you in the talk today, rationales for those different types of pairings and then consequences of those pairings in terms of both racial consciousness and culture. So I aim to demonstrate in this talk that as individualistic and personal as romantic choices feel, they're actually steered by social forces including racial politics, cultural mores, family conventions, as well as local demographics. So by situating marriage and family within the landscape of race, relations, gender politics, and class concerns, I demonstrate that even our most intimate relations are inflected with power dynamics that supersede and even inform our romantic choices. So I want to dive right into the data to illustrate what I mean. So this woman was an interviewee in Kansas. Her name is Xochitl Velasco. These are all pseudonyms, by the way. And so she told me that essentially she was acutely aware of the racial hierarchy as she was dating. She told me, my cousins, when they brought white boyfriends home, it was kind of looked at like, congratulations. She brought home this really nice looking young man named Tad or Donnie, Timothy or Chad or Dylan. The white men were considered like moving up, successful. My family was very racist against African Americans. They would use really poor language. It would never be appreciated to bring an African American man home or even a woman home as a boyfriend, girlfriend. African American men were looked at like, just don't bring them home unless you want trouble with your dad. And the Mexican men were just looked at as status quo and not doing anything really great. Right? So here she pretty much outlines the messaging that she's getting from her family about the racial hierarchy and the different messages and receptions she would get based on the racial background of various suitors that she might bring home. So the research questions for the project are, what are the rationales, thinking here again about race, gender, class, and national origin behind marital choices? And then what are the consequences of marital choices, again, both in marriage or endogamy and out marriage exogamy, on racial and ethnic identification and consciousness for both adult partners and their children. I'm not going to touch too much on the children in this talk today. So much scholarship concerning Latinos uses an assimilation framework that assesses integration of immigrant groups into a host country. And so the debate really is about the long-term fate of Latinos in the US. Are they going to be trying to reconquer the Southwest? Are they going to eventually assimilate like other white ethnics? Or are they going to assimilate downward into an already marginalized subgroup? So the debate is fueled by anxiety about disuniting or browning of American culture. We have Latinos now constituting 17% of the population nationwide. So they now are the largest minority group. And typically, intermarriage as a component of assimilation theory is seen as a measure of social distance, suggesting that heightened acceptance of minority groups is what's indicated in intermarriage. So the focus then is on whites kind of deigning almost, right, to intermarry with non-whites. So the focus then is on privileging whiteness and then accepting non-whites. So that's obviously something I'm going to be critiquing in this talk. Another frame about marriage is concerning love. So there's kind of a Western concept of mythic love and personal choice that I'm going to be troubling in this talk, and obviously kind of zooming out and thinking about structural and cultural forces that shape our personal and romantic desires. So I then take a broader race relations framing. So my dissatisfaction with assimilation literature has a couple points to it. So one is assimilation theory treats intermarriage as an outcome. So yay, success, intermarriage, right? That's an endpoint. And the assimilation theory presumes that changes occur prior to intermarriage. And I then turn that assimilation theory on its head and ask, well, what about intermarriage as a point of departure? So intermarriage and then possibly spurring on change attitudes, outlooks, and relationships. The focus in intermarriage also tends to be on, like I referred to before, kind of minority groups that are prescriptively kind of asked or tasked to change, rather than really opening up to this possibility of bidirectional or two-way change, which again is something that I highlight as in my work and kind of critique as a shortfall of assimilation theory. And then again, there's a historical invisibility of whites in intermarriage. The focus tends to be on the non-whites, whereas whites are left as the invisible standard. Kind of alongside intermarriage and assimilation theory, I also make use of intersectionality theory. So this notion of race, gender, class, national origin being co-constitutive and mutually transforming. And that helps make sense of the data that will come. So even as there's a lot of kind of theoretical and popular, I would argue, interest in intermarriage, intramarriage or same-race relations continues to be the norm that's under-theorized. So in the United States, a full 87% of people in the United States marry within their own racial category. Relative to non-Hispanic whites specifically, only 4% outmarry. So clearly race persists as a powerful division in the marriage market. You know, I think I misspoke. So the 4% is referring to Hispanic and non-Hispanic pairings. Okay, so I want to refer briefly to the legal and social construction of desire. So thinking about the role of law, we have immigration law, which shapes directly the possibility of who one might partner with and then reproduce with. That excludes certain national origin groups as well as excludes certain bodies, right, from appearing in the nation. I'm going to spend more time thinking about, so I'm going to take that as kind of the structural background, and then I'm going to spend more time talking about the role of social systems, thinking about family, peers, and community level processes that come out in terms of so family of origin experiences, so the socialization and messaging that's happening within families of origin. Then also enter prior dating experiences, so whether people have a good or bad experience romantically or with friend groups and what that means for their dating life. Encounters with stereotypes. Advice. Counsel is a really interesting one about being counseled towards some groups or away from others. And then censure or violence or threats of violence as, of course, also being very pertinent. So there are gaps in assimilation literature that I'm going to be addressing and filling. So there are quantitative approaches that report trends, but they don't actually account for rationales or the nuances of outcomes. So what's actually happening to lead to these trends and what's actually happening once these people pair. The consequences of in and out marriage are presumed rather than actually empirically examined. Like I mentioned, there's an exclusive focus on Latinos or non-Latino minorities as those who should change, and an absence of actually interrogating what's going on with whiteness. And there's an overlooking that's going on relative to Latino and non-Latino minority pairings that I'm not going to overlook. So in terms of methods and data, I conducted in-depth interviews face-to-face with lifetime partners and their children, and I was using that language of lifetime partner, though I did get heterosexual married couples. I recruited through Latino serving organizations, high schools, churches, professional contacts that I already had, and snowball sampling. So asking people to refer me to others once I'd conducted an interview with them. And then I had 2 field sites. I was faculty at the University of Kansas at the time, so I had 1 field site there, as well as in Southern California, Los Angeles County in particular. So you'll see racial and ethnic demographics in the environment play a part. I interviewed 109 respondents from 50 families, and they were evenly split roughly between California and Kansas. So one partner of the 2 partners was either Latino who was US born or 1.5 generations, so if foreign born arrived by the age of 12. And then relative to intermarriage, so Latinos and non-Hispanic whites, as well as Latinos and Asians, natives, and blacks. And then intramarriage, Latinos partnering with other Latinos. So just briefly to remind us about the state demographics, I'll just draw your attention to the numbers of non-Hispanic whites we've got, or whites. So in California, we've got 60% white, 40% non-Hispanic white. Kansas, 85% white, 78% non-Hispanic white. And that's comparing with, period. And then this over here just lets us know the Hispanic population nationwide is about 17%. And then, I guess I don't have that up here for the states individually. But suffice it to say that far more Hispanics in California than in Kansas. So this just reminds you of who I interviewed. So 41 people, these are not couples, these are individuals, who were Latinos and whites that were intermarried to each other. And I did conduct interviews mostly with partners. I did them individually, but I usually got 2 of the people who were in the partnership together. So you get kind of a flow between the 2, which is nice, a correspondence. And then you had fewer, and this does follow the kind of nationwide numbers. I had the smallest number of Latino and non-Latino minorities who were paired. And then the intramarriage was also the largest number, again, following the nationwide statistics. So what I want to push forward today is this notion of negotiated desire. So I'm arguing that this is the process by which people become attuned to what they want in a partner and how they maneuver in a local context. So this is taking into account all those things I mentioned before on kind of the social life angle, starting from natal family experiences. So I argue that this operates on 3 levels. So the personal level, which is kind of the internal, mental, and emotional processes that people go through as they kind of literally think and feel their way through their situations. Interactional, so that's more the actual negotiation that's going on wherein people are dating and each party assesses their own needs and desires and in comparison with what the partner is offering. And then the structural considers the local environment, specifically racial and ethnic demographics, who's actually available in the local marriage market. So from here, I'm going to start to discuss rationales about how people got into relationships that they were in. So I'm following the order of Latino white, and then Latino non-Latino minority, and then the intra-married individuals, and I'll talk about the variance later, because that's typically seen as a kind of monolithic block, and shockingly it's not actually a monolith. There's some variation therein. So I'd like to introduce to you first Celeste Collins, who links her patriarchal Latino father with her deliberate intention to outmarry. So she says that we had a very traditional household. My dad was a traditional strong male figure, and my mother was clearly the nurturing one. This sounds terrible, but I did not want to marry anybody like my dad. He's too domineering, and everything had to center on him. That was not attractive to me, so I think I consciously did not want to pursue anyone that looked like my dad. So Celeste and other Latina women who deliberately pursued outmarriage as a sort of gender survival strategy, so a way to avoid negative experiences or traits that they associated with Latino men, engaged in what psychologist Maria Root calls color coding. So in her study of multiracials, those who, quote, who had been treated cruelly by a parent color-coded this experience and stayed away from people who resembled that person racially, end quote. So this logic then castigates an entire ethnic and racial category of people for prior negative experiences involving a single Latino male, a father in this case. Celeste and others like her self-protectively casts a wide net and excludes Latino men from her dating pool to guard against the domination that she associates with her father. So she made a motivated choice, if you will, to marry outside of her racial category. Class status also is operative. So as to perceiving marriage as a class advancement strategy, meet Rowena Cooper, and she was by far the one who's most conscious and articulate about what was going on. Others were a little bit more soft-spoken, letting us think about the degree to which people are conscious versus less conscious about these choices or reasons for choices. So Rowena Cooper is a Mexican-American from California, and she made a class-based calculation to outmarry. So class trumps race or ethnicity in her story, as I guess I'm forecasting. So class trumps race or ethnicity. As a child, she learned about a labor system that was stratified by race in Bakersfield, where she grew up. She simply observed her surroundings and summarized to me, the Caucasians were the farm owners, the Hispanics were the worker bees. Perceiving that race and ethnicity and class were confounded, at age 13, she bargained with her parents to allow her to work after school so she could buy her own clothing. She wanted to appear higher class than she actually was. She engaged in a Goffman-esque presentation of self in order to attract middle and upper class men. She and her sisters distinguished themselves from their modest circumstances by strategic use of clothing. We were doing this. If you dress less, then what do you attract? You know how the saying goes, you are who you associate with. How do you look? How do you dress? Do you look like a chola, a working class Latina? So that's probably why it was so natural for us to marry Caucasians. And I always tell my students, let's interrogate natural anytime you hear it, right? So Rowena's romantic taste, which we know from Bourdieu, are class-inflected, for white men actually reveal a desire for socioeconomic mobility and white privilege. Rowena, interestingly enough, met her Caucasian first husband while working at a bank. She was a teller and he was a customer. So again, a Bourdieusian reading of taste as a signifier of class status is relevant here. So I asked, what would you say were the main qualities that you were interested in? And she says, our tastes were the same. We enjoyed nice things. We saved money to get what we wanted. Through fashioning herself as appealing for Caucasian men who were class advantaged, she made it natural, as she says, to marry a white man and consolidate access to whiteness and middle class privilege. So imagery, and here enter kind of the recognition that I'm in the journalism school, imagery white men had of Latina women boosted their desire for them. So white men interviewees consistently discussed Latina women as beautiful, sexy, and possessing virtues that would make them good wives. Maybe it's because of stereotyping from TV or jokes. I just thought a darker-haired gal would be more of a wife material, more prone to family life. So irrespective of the origin of this image, it fomented Kent's appreciation for darker-skinned females, which directed his dating patterns and marital choice. This image also, I should say, of Latina women as family-oriented also motivated Latino men's interest, not just white men's interest. So I wanted to insert this, again, thinking about media, because there was a young woman, Paloma, who was talking to me about how she actually had a good example of gender, more or less gender equality between her Mexican immigrant grandparents, which is the real life, but she also had what we'll call a mediated experience of kind of negative controlling images or stereotypes around Latino people, and men in particular, she identifying as heterosexual, that dampened her enthusiasm for Latino men as potential partners. So she says, between my Mexican immigrant grandparents, everything is pretty equal. If my grandma cooks dinner, my grandpa is the one that cleans. Sometimes they both cook dinner, they both clean. It's usually equal, and it's not like, oh, you're a woman, get behind the stove in the kitchen, that's where you belong. So I said, so if that was the role model that you had, where does this idea that she told me before come from that you don't want to marry a Mexican because you worry that they would be domineering and take priority? Seems like a bit of a contradiction, right? Also reminding us that we have lots of forces that shape our desires. Paloma says, I honestly don't really know. I think it's just like how it's portrayed. You're around the media representations of it more than you are around it in real life. You don't get that many examples of it in real life. Again, she was also in Kansas, right? So few and far between with Latinos. So if you grow up watching telenovelas, Mexican soap operas, or whatever, that's what's there and that's what you think. So this is simply to kind of switch back to whites and to suggest that having multicultural parents actually allows for an open door for whites to go ahead and marry someone who's non-white. And then relative to population demographics, this was actually a pretty hilarious, though I tried to keep calm interviewer face with no expressions, exchange. So just a bit of my own positionality. So I identify as Latina. I grew up in Southern California. I was then a faculty member at the University of Kansas. And so I show up to do an interview with a woman who identifies as Mexican American in Kansas, and she's married with a white man. And so she then illustrates having kind of constrained choice, meaning that she was operating with agency within a situation of constraint, of demographic constraint, right? She only had a certain amount of people to pick from, and the demographics were largely white. So she tells me it'd kind of be a joke that I couldn't date any people that were Mexican in Lawrence, Kansas, because we were related to most of the Mexican people in Lawrence, as she laughs. So me, interviewer face, right? Really? So that wasn't just an exaggeration? No. Also by marriage, we would be related to somebody, so that was still a no-no for me. I heard this from lots of people, right? So kind of fascinating, and so that was definitely a surprise. But very much illustrates the role of structural realities. So on to Latino and non-Latino racial minority intermarriages. Here we see a minority-minority connection, or kind of a cross-minority connection as a rationale for marriage. And here what's really important are kind of the racial and class sympathies that are presumed but also kind of ferreted out and kind of proven to be true or confirmed. And that particularly critical lens on race and class created a foundation for a long-term partnership. So here we have Travis Strong, who, as a Native American, expressed a deep and dear connection for Mexican people. He was saying that we are all brown people, as he rubs his finger across his arm. And he tells me, we don't call Mexicans them. In our eyes, the Lakota eyes, they are our brothers and sisters. They are no different. They're Indians too. So they're Indians too harkens back to the historical origins of Mexicans as a union between the Spanish conquering forces of Hernan Cortez and Montezuma's Aztec Empire in the 1530s. Using the term brown people, that refers to skin color, land possession, and colonization, rhetorically unifies then natives and Mexicans. Travis tacitly invoked the notion of linked fate, whereby group-level political interests are seen as a proxy for self-interest. And in this case, right, a foundation for a marriage with his part Native, part Mexican origin wife. So I probably, in the interest of time, should skip the next example. But this is an interesting example of another set of people who met and found kind of a racial and class home with themselves because they had cultural similarities in life. But I want to make sure to highlight this interesting notion of kind of as this man put it, going to Mexico to find a wife. And his notion was about how culture would inhere in differently racialized women, which is not unlike what we saw from the Latina women who chose to outmarry, because they're presuming that there was a particular kind of standpoint and privilege that would bias interactions with men. So, hang on. There we go. Right, so both men and women I interviewed held on to the corresponding assumption that culture inheres in people generally, right, and potentially those who they might date. So some men preferred to date and marry Latinas, even seeking out immigrant women who were closer to the cultural source of a foreign country, which is the case with Omar Zelaya, who was born to Mexican immigrants in Southern California. So he judged the lifestyle in the US to be too unreserved. When Omar decided that he was ready for a significant relationship, he decided that he would visit his relatives back in Mexico. So here we get a transnational angle also, where he deliberately goes to Mexico, as he says, to find a wife. So he says to himself, hey, I got to start establishing something. So I went on vacation to Aguascalientes, Mexico. I should just try to go find a wife from Mexico, find a woman from Mexico, because maybe she'll understand me better, and I just want to raise a family. If my Mexican immigrant parents were a certain way, I think I could relate to a girl that was more this way, right? So he's trying to go to the cultural source. where he presumes that he's going to find the cultural traits that he wants and finds important. So food, Catholicism, and a certain set of values. And again, in contrast to the American women, which you say are too unreserved, too independent. And he did tell me about cases of being spurned by white women. And he was, on the one hand, saying, oh, that didn't bother me. On the other hand, saying he was spurned. And then kind of wrapping this all up by choosing to go to Mexico to find a wife, right? So you can see how in that choice that's actually reflecting rejection from white women. Okay. So thinking again now about another rationale for in-marriage, this is the same woman that we met in the very beginning who talked about the racial hierarchy and being very aware of it as she was dating. And so here, I want to highlight the cultural commonality aspect and the desire that people had to escape stereotypes, particularly Latino women wanted to escape stereotypes imposed by whites that were common among people who chose to intramarry. So Xochitl tells me, I grew up with Mexicans, boys and girls. I just always felt really comfortable. It wasn't until I went to college and dating a white guy would I see differences between him and I. White men that are married to my Latina girlfriends, they like the Latina spice. They make fun of her accent. They think it's cute. They like the exoticness. I just looked at those as stereotypes, and I don't ever like that. I don't want to be treated as an other in my relationship, right? So it was her own experience, in addition to what she was seeing around her from her friends, that shaped her desire away from a certain category of people. So she clearly does not want to be exoticized in her intimate relationship, and she grounds her desire for cultural similarity and respect for her individual personhood in prior dating experiences and observations of others. So there's a similarity here between cross-minority pairs, so Latino and non-Latino minorities, and in-married couples, so other Latinos marrying other Latinos. In that they're both seeking a racial haven, but the difference is that for Xochitl, she had enough kind of comfort in the cultural generally that she didn't feel like she needed to escape the entire Latino category. She just picked a different variant. So she chose, as a Mexican-American woman, a Bolivian dual citizen, right? So does that make sense? That, right? So she went kind of further, one side, half a step away, but not into an entirely different group. And now, just a quick preview of the consequences and the flow that will follow from here. So, again, thinking about the absence in assimilation theory about whites, this is where I want to intervene. So Tomas Jimenez, a scholar at Stanford, he's theorized about affiliative ethnic identity as a knowledge-based enactment based on ethnically linked symbols and practices. So divorcing race ethnicity from practice and highlighting cultural activity creates space for bidirectional boundary crossing and boundary blurring. So based on their gendered understandings of themselves as representing a family culture, intermarried white women tended to become affiliative ethnics, migrating into Latino culture and transmitting it to their children. So here you see white women reflecting on their own, what they considered kind of vacant white identity, and then absorbing their Latino husband's identity and transmitting it to the children. So you see very much a gendered rationale, right, as kind of women as the keeper of the home, add that to kind of a void of whiteness and an absence of a community of white ethnics that they attach to, enter in the significance of a Latino husband. So Deirdre, Ignacio Gonzalez's wife, is a prime example of this. So Ignacio Gonzalez, who has a son of the same name, tells me of his wife who's taking Spanish classes. I think the person that reminds me the most that I'm Latino is my wife, Deirdre. She reminds me that we have to speak Spanish to the kids. Deirdre said, how can you give your son a name like Ignacio Gonzalez and have him not be able to speak Spanish, right? So there's some prodding from the wife. So non-Hispanic white partners who adopt and maintain a spouse's ethnic culture then runs counter to assimilation theory. Assimilation theory is like, boom, into whiteness you go. And this directly contradicts that, with Deirdre saying, no, I'll learn Spanish and you need to enforce Spanish too. There are other examples, flipping briefly to non-Latino minorities, so Asians, Natives, and Blacks, they can have the same experience as well. So Trinity Valencia, she identifies as black, but she's technically a black-white multiracial mix. She tells me that she had kind of a horrific set of incidences in her youth from kind of racist property damage and exclusion from the black student club because she wasn't black enough, yet she was kind of the target of racist insults and property damage. So she was looking for a home, so to speak, and community. So she found that in the Hispanic American Leadership Organization in college in Kansas, and where she tells me that nobody questioned why I was in the group. Nobody said, you can't do this, we don't think you're not Hispanic. So I think partly what's happening here is because Hispanic identity is a racial admixture already, she as a mixed race person found a home there. And her husband, Rodrigo, is Mexican American, jokes with her, and now I made you an honorary Hispanic, you know, in terms of the food and the music that they enjoy together, you know, a Latino. Right, so again, this is an example that runs counter to assimilation theory. And actually, there's just simply a gap in assimilation theory that doesn't much care about non-whites marrying other non-whites. So moving back to whites, I wanted to share, and then I can skip a few things to be able to take questions, but I would love to share with you a very eloquent white young man who was married with a Mexican immigrant who was a visa overstayer. So he's a prime example of reaching a new level of awareness concerning race and immigration status as a result of his marriage to a Mexican immigrant visa overstayer. So he tells me, it's obvious that minorities are closer to the bottom and whites are closer to the top. The system is set up so that it continues. So I've definitely been made aware of that, especially with my wife's situation. You're not letting, meaning the country is not letting people work, so when they do work, you get mad at them, but how else are they supposed to get the money to pay the fees to naturalize? It makes me really mad to see the two-faced stuff. There are different things that I've looked at now that I wouldn't have considered before, just because, sadly enough, I think when things don't directly affect us, then we don't think about them as much. So whites who express this type of heightened salience of race linked it directly to seeing life through the eyes of their minority spouse, what Ruth Frankenberg calls rebound racism. So a racism whereby white family members feel a ripple effect of racism directed towards a loved one. There is, however, I should say, an opposite tendency of minimizing racism. So this notion of, I think that everyday living, race doesn't matter. We all get up and brush our teeth. So there's been kind of theoretical developments around colorblind racism, and yet I think there probably should be room for a non-racist version of colorblindness that in this case you'll notice is articulated relative to the domestic sphere, right? So expressing the sort of minimization of race relative to the domestic sphere does not preclude whites who are married to Latinos from spying racism in the public sphere. Okay, so another minute or two, I'm happy to wrap so we can have questions. So one other interesting consequence of Latino and Asian Native Black marriage are linkages that the people involved in the marriages made that deliberately decenter whiteness. And there was a lot of creativity around this, which I thought was pretty fascinating. Fascinating slash, surprising in the moment. Again, interviewer face of like, tell me more, that's interesting. So Caroline Wu, who identifies Latina, is intermarried with a Chinese American man, and she says that my cousins say my Chinese American husband looks more Latin than I do. Besides the obvious similarity like physical characteristics, there's eating things that aren't part of the regular day-to-day American diet. Often we joke that Chinese and Ecuadorian people really are the same race. So she's doing, right, a creative job to graph similarity between herself and her Chinese American husband, right, in this kind of pan non-white group. She has a vested interest in decentering whiteness and kind of fusing similarities among herself and her partner. Apparently I talk more in person than I do in practice. So one other element, so there is an element of exploring and blending cultures, as you might imagine. in cross-national intermarriages, so people who hail from different national origin groups, but within the Latino category, so people who have taken on eating rice, not just tortillas, and different types of foods based on their partner. And then something, again, that assimilation theory completely overlooks is the fact that in marriage, so Latinos marrying other Latinos can oftentimes come, even if they're from the same nation of origin, come from different generations since immigration, if they even immigrated at all, right? Meaning perhaps some families lived in the territory of the United States prior to 1848. So this couple is an example of I think he's a second generation, so his parents, I believe, were immigrants, and his family continued to live in an ethnic enclave in Los Angeles, and his wife, as he says, was already on the third generation, so she's third, and she was also mixed with white, and so he says she's already assimilated. I think I've done a good job assimilating, right? So interesting value judgment there, but I don't think I'm there, you know? I think one way was to marry Anna. Benefits, retirement, there was a lot of things that I never really thought of before meeting Anna. It's a gringo thing, you know? So kind of, there's a class element there, there's a generation element there. Those two, in terms of, those two are interlinked in terms of class status does tend to rise over generations in the United States. And then I'm gonna skip the last example, but suffice it to say here that you know, as might be obvious to us who think about it, it's not obvious to the literature that Latinos marrying other Latinos don't necessarily want to continue to cling to a Latino culture. I mean, a lot of the reactionary rhetoric and literature sometimes presumes that, unfortunately, certainly the media. No offense, I know I'm in the journalism school, but the pushback then is coming from people who clearly have had a pretty difficult racialized, classed and gendered experience, whereby this man was telling me how he lived in the quote-unquote ghetto, as he told me, of East LA, and he saw drive-by shootings, his friends were killed, he narrowly escaped death in prison himself, and so he's telling me that why would you want that to be part of your life, meaning Latino identity, because to him, class oppression, race oppression, and being assumed to be a thug because he was a low-class Latino man in his youth were all intertwined, and so that's what Latino meant to him. So he engaged in a social distancing strategy, which is important relative to finding a partner, because he then had I don't want that part of my life. He met another partner who hailed from the Mexican-American background as well. She had the similar experience, right? In her case, she had been married to a gangbanger. That didn't turn out well. And so they both then wanted to socially distance themselves from Latinos. Again, the context here is relevant in that they both were from Los Angeles. And so there's the Los Angeles as the epicenter of the gang problem being very relevant in these people's lives. And so to marry with another Latino clearly does not mean that you therefore are adhering to a particular set of cultural practices or identities. So in sum, I'm simply arguing that the shaping of desire is a process. It begins with one's family of origin, and then social, oftentimes dating experiences intervene. So these interactional experiences are always racialized, gendered, and classed, and they sharpen our desire over the life course. And then the contributions then are this idea of negotiated desire, the construction of desire based on intersectional concerns, so race, gender, class, nation, that are rooted in prior natal and social experiences. I've been stressing, of course, all along the bidirectional porousness of racial and ethnic boundaries, intermarriage being a starting point for some, not just an endpoint for changed outlooks, the role of affiliative ethnics, and then the flexing of some boundaries where you see cross-racial solidarity in some cases, the hardening of other boundaries. There I'm thinking of kind of anti-Black discrimination or anti-Latino discrimination coming from whites that I heard of. And then in some, how the racial hierarchy then bears down on our personal lives. So while the saying, love makes the world go round, might capture this book's findings by, that saying might be able to capture this book's findings if it were rephrased as, love changes the world as the world goes round, right? So love is not a panacea for racial ills, but it does put people in close, caring contact enough to provide alternative perspectives. So from an increased understanding of racial inequality to comfort in a subjugated community that provides a racial haven behind closed doors. That's it for now.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Questions?
I kind of have a question.
Sure.
And it goes to your demographics.
Sure.
And I'm guessing all the interviews were conducted in English.
Yes, they were.
So do you think, or did you experience any code switching during the interviews?
Some, yes. So I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I'm like, I can catch some of the basics. And I can be okay if I have to be, but mostly it was small thing. I mean, in Kansas, that wasn't really an issue. I was advertising in English, which I think was part of it too. So I captured people who were English speakers, and yeah, so it's really minimal things like the telenovelas.
So do you think that the language would have played a role in trying to find different outcomes? Like
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's probably, but not exclusively, correlated with class status too. So I think there's probably there's probably a parallel that's happening. So yeah, I probably would have gotten greater class variety if I had been able to interview Spanish speakers, or especially Spanish monolingual folks. So I imagine, like, referring to John Ortega, who I mentioned at the very end. So if I'd been able to interview people who were from, say, that quote unquote ghetto neighborhood that he grew up in a native, Spanish language, I would have probably had a very different set of interviews. But I didn't. I mean, I think what you're also getting at too is the fact that a lot of, I don't know exactly the numbers, but if you have Latin American immigrants who immigrate as adults, many of them are partnered. And so then they tend to land in ethnic enclaves that tend to be kind of marginalized communities that are underinvested in. And so that wouldn't speak so much to finding a partner if they're already partnered, but that would speak to perhaps how they parent their children, their children's experiences, or if someone is a solo kind of migrant, for example, the local environment would really, really matter. Something I actually cut I still ran long, but something I cut for the purpose of timing, I think speaks to your point, just this idea of people who did live in East LA. I have one, and if they were former gang members, they were telling me stories of this one man has this great turn of phrase, being contained by his environment, which I thought was just pretty stunning, because he literally felt like he couldn't physically get too far from that environment, and the gang was always kind of around, kind of keeping tabs, and he was beholden to them in a certain way. And he was dating, and he ended up marrying a gang girl, and he ended up jumping out. But like, clearly there's that containment based on his word, based on the local environment that is structured by racial segregation. Right? Even those who weren't gangbangers in their youth were telling me, well, gosh, my neighbors and my friends at school, like, they were all Mexican American, so like that was clearly my world. Like, what else was I gonna do, right? Yeah, so I think you're totally right. I would have gotten a different set of respondents who told me different stories.
I will let her. Yeah.
Sure.
No, you go.
Yeah, I was just curious as well in terms of like the age group, because generationally there is also differences in how we approach. I'm thinking like older generations of immigrants who kind of refuse to teach their children Spanish and just want to kind of get that, the idea of stereotypes onto their children, like you're an American now, you're an American. And so I'm wondering, with this kind of discourse around reclaiming that Latinx identity, what it's like maybe for age group, if that played at all in your interviews or
Totally. Yeah, so I think, I'll reach back, if it's okay, to my first book also, which was, it's called Mexican Americans Across Generations, and I did interviews with first-generation immigrants, their second-generation children, and their third-generation grandchildren. And there you clearly see popping out from the data this sort of, also, right, correlated with timing, right? There's much older people who were here in the 50s, 60s, 70s, like early 70s, they were pretty interested in shedding Spanish, if ever spoken, only inside the house, raise you without an accent relative to English. So the reclamation is pretty fascinating in that that's more for that book, that was more a third generation kind of liberatory moment because of the kind of more pro affirmative action, greater tolerance for diversity that typifies the 90s and later. But you have instances there where, as much as we tend to think of generational knowledge going from older generations to younger, right, passing down the generational ladder from grandparents to parents to children, this reclamation business was actually moving from the younger generations who were free to reclaim their background to move up the generational ladder to the parents and the grandparents, which is pretty, I think, fascinating sociologically and just as a cultural phenomenon. Yeah, so that's a great point.
So you talk about kind of multiple levels, not only personal level, but also interactional, level and community level that comes from kind of social construction of intermarriage and intramarriage approach. So I like how you approach those kind of multiple levels, how they play out in affecting those kind of inter and intramarriage. And could you talk? I was wondering how kind of the community level, if any, and what type of community, ethnic community or religious community, or some sort of online community where multi-ethnic groups participate in, or so how what kind of community level plays affecting their marriage.
So good question. So everything from participation in ethnic oriented groups that serve as a social kind of outlet that's grounded in ethnicity to I actually have a more, what's the word, I guess negative take almost, like a disciplinary take when I examine in an article what's going on at the community level, so thinking about families and peers and social networks. So that's not groups per se, but that's the kind of interactional community level that you're asking about. And so there, a lot of what I saw were essentially racist mechanisms that were promoting Latino endogamy. So Latino intramarriage, because as I mentioned, right, there's a lot of racism that Latinos encounter if they try to move up, so to speak, the racial ladder and date whites. Here I've got plenty of examples of people, men in particular, being told, either being thrown downstairs, right, by the father of a white would-be date, or being chased out of the house with a gun, being brandished by a father, right? So here you have kind of brown masculinity, kind of threatening, right, white reproductive possibilities, right? So there's that sort of thing happening, as well as there's anti-black discrimination happening, such that you add those all together and you get this, as one woman called it, well, chickens go with chickens, right? This sort of normalization of, well, we're our own group, so we should stick together, right? But that's sort of a distillation of messaging that has been received over the life course that kind of make it clear that there's a bounded group within one should more comfortably stay, right? And that's not to say there are not interesting, creative intermarriages happening, but just that perhaps they've encountered different barriers or have different, they've had to encounter and create different defense mechanisms or ways of operating in order to do that. Yeah.
Okay, 3 questions.
Sure.
The first question is about even you talk about the intermarriage among the Latinos. Mostly, I think you focus on Mexican American. I'm thinking about perceptually or maybe belief system, culturally. Since Latino is such a category, including South America, Central America, the residents or immigrants, and at least my observation, I don't know if there is a hierarchy in the sense, social class-based hierarchy within the Latinos. So they still make a conscious choices. Certainly the people who come here from, say, just do this, the manual labor are different, are perceived differently from people who are come here. I mean, that could be South America, son, son and daughter of this, the rich business person, something like that, correct? Yes. So this type, I'm wondering how visible, or at least how consciously people wear this kind of the class division among the Latinos. Yeah. Okay, that's one question. And I can say about the question before you forget.
Sure,
okay.
Sure. That's great. You are absolutely right. And I would say whether conscious or not, there is that sort of assortative mating that's happening along class lines. You're totally right. So a great example of that. Thank you, Deb. Hi. Great to see you. A great example. So yes, there definitely was an awareness on a lot of people's part. And even if there wasn't, I think it was still operating as kind of a don't slip down the ladder, like either stay the same class category or move up, right? So an excellent example of that is a Cuban-American woman who was who married, but this is skewing your point a little bit because I get, let me say the example and then it's the best example I have, but I think it was still operative relative to Latinos, but the best example about class homogamy being really paramount is with a Cuban-American woman who is married with a white man. Yeah. So there it's different than what you're asking, but I think it proves the same point, that if there's a racial gap, right, or difference, so to speak, where you've got the Cuban-American, right, but of the Latino categories, they, depending on when her parents immigrated, right, she's fairer skinned, she came from a better socioeconomic background, more education. So that's going to be more palatable to the non-Hispanic white upper middle class husband's family. And so that's exactly what happened. So there was initially when this white man told his family, hey, I'm dating, I guess at the time, a Latina woman. He got a little pushback about, well, what do you mean? Like, who's that? A Mexican so-and-so? It was like, no, Cuban. Okay, well, maybe tell me a little more, right? So not Mexican, okay, Cuban. Well, what does that mean? Well, it turns out both of the partners who eventually married and had kids, both had the same level of college degree from the same university. Both fathers were optometrists. Right? I mean, there was all this parallel that made it okay because the class advantage that she was bringing kind of made up for the racial disadvantage. So I think that that's a starker example because it's an intermarriage to show that, class made it okay. Class money whitened in that case. And among Latinos, I think it's less striking, but I think the same thing is absolutely happening. And there's the demographic literature out there saying that it's the lighter skinned Latinos who are the ones that are more likely to outmarry with whites anyway, and then darker skinned, including in my sample, are more likely to either in-marry or encourage in-marriage with their kids or marry other minorities, so Asians, natives, and blacks. So yeah, so I think there's a skin color difference that's interestingly pertinent too.
So have minutes.
Can I have one more question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So this related, I just say that you talk about the racist colorblind approach and non-racist colorblind approach. So I'm wondering how you make this distinction.
Oh, so I was simply saying that, because you're right, there's a lot of interesting, very important literature on colorblind racism. I was arguing that kind of in intermarriages, and not to say that racism can't happen within marriage, right, to be clear, but within marriages that do seem kind of race cognizant, like race aware, and progressive in seeing racism, those families also were talking about the sort of, race doesn't matter in the sense that we all get up and brush our teeth, right, kind of within the domestic sphere, where it's kind of understood that racism happens out there, that there was a minimization that was happening, kind of that allowed their relationship to function while still understanding they had different racialized experiences outside the home. So that hasn't really been theorized, and I wouldn't probably be the one to offer that because I think that would probably get slapped down as like, whoa, what are you saying? Like, I'm not saying there's not any colorblind racism, but I think there might be more room for an optimistic variant that is being illustrated by some people.
Yeah.